I'm Heather Coleman, and I'm the director of the program on religion and culture at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. And I'm happy to welcome you to the annual Bociurkiw Memorial Lecture. Dr. Bohdan Bociurkiw began his academic career at the University of Alberta, where he taught in the Department of Political Science from 1956 to 1969. And then he went on to teach at Carleton University in Ottawa, where he was one of the founders and the founding director of the Institute of what was called Soviet and East European Studies. It's now called the Institute of European and Russian Studies there. He was a specialist in Soviet politics with a special emphasis on Soviet Ukraine and church-state relations. There's seats up here at the front where nobody wants to sit. His final book, The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Soviet State, 1939 to 1950, was published by CIUS Press in 1996, and it remains really the authoritative work on the subject in English. In 1994, Dr. Bohdan Bociurkiw's generous donation of his extensive library and personal archives to the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies represented the first step in the eventual creation of the program on religion and culture at the Institute. The collection contains many unique items, documents and books pertaining to the Ukrainian Church, including documents drawn from the closed archives of the Communist Party and the KGB. And it serves as the basis for the program's reference library. Our speaker today, Professor Andrii Krawchuk, has a special connection to Professor Bociurkiw and his collection. It was he who compiled the 328-page inventory of the collection, the Guide to the Library and Archives, which can be found on the program's website in a PDF. So today he was able for the first time to see it all here in situ at CIUS. So it's thus a particular pleasure to welcome Dr. Krawchuk to Edmonton, an old friend of CIUS and somebody who played a role in the development of this program. Andrii is a professor of religious studies and past president of the University of Sudbury. He received his PhD in theology from St. Paul's University in Ottawa, and he's the author of a monograph called Christian Social Ethics in Ukraine, The Legacy of Andrii Krawchuk, which was published by CIUS Press in 1997. He's co-editor with Thomas Bremer of a collected volume called Eastern Orthodox Encounters of Identity and Otherness, Values, Self-Reflection, Dialogue, which was published in 2014. He's also edited numerous other documentary collections on religion, society, and ethics in Eastern Europe. And his current research, from which his talk today derives, is on interreligious dialogue and intercultural ethics in the wake of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. So the topic of Dr. Krawchuk's talk this evening, the impact of Russia's intervention in Ukraine on Muslim, Jewish, and Baptist communities, is a particularly fitting one for our annual lecture honoring Bohdan Bociurkiw, because it addresses the great theme that absorbed Professor Bociurkiw throughout his career, that of religion and the state in Ukraine. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrii Krawchuk.
I once delivered a lecture in Montreal, my hometown, and it happened to be on Bociurkiw that I was working on in those years. And at the end of it, one person who had a good impression of what I had presented said, "Via nash Bociurkiw." So I don't know. I don't even know what that means. But anyway, thank you, Heather, for the introduction. Thank you as well for inviting me. It's really an honor to be back. I was first here in 1982, and I may have visited a few more times, but it's almost like a homecoming, because people are friends through CAS and through many other associations. It's always a pleasure to be with you. I'm honored to be here also as part of the Bohdan Bociurkiw Memorial Lecture Series. As Heather was mentioning, in my years in Ottawa, I was very privileged to know Bohdan Bociurkiw as an esteemed professor, whose courses I took at Carleton University, as a mentor, as a cherished colleague, and a true friend. And when he asked me to prepare a finding aid of his collection, and as part of that, I did a biobibliography. And one thing has stood out in my memory. I haven't seen that finding aid for many years, but I remember particular things. One of those is that although he was highly noted for his work on the Greek Catholic Church, there was a wide range of topics in terms of ethnic and religious diversity that he covered, from his doctoral dissertation on the Russian Orthodox Church to other articles that came to my attention later in his career that included Islam and the Soviet Union. And when I was including that in the biobibliography, I thought, well, what does that topic have to do with anything? And here I am now, as you mentioned, moving into an area of interreligious dialogue where the Muslim question is of great interest to me, both in Ukraine and in Russia. And I sometimes, ask myself, how did I come to this? There's something that I think was inspiring about this man, and that I think of him when I'm doing my research, and he continues to inspire me. So I think that's the kind of thing that many of us aspire to as scholars, to be remembered in that way. Truly a great friend and unforgettable person, human being. I came to this topic because of the events in Ukraine, when things began to happen at the Maidan, and when things began to get much worse with the aggression. I actually had to visit a cardiologist, and then in the summertime when I visited Ukraine, I was able to come to a more calm place. I was able to meet quite a number of people, and I was intrigued when I heard that Russian Orthodox bishops in Ukraine were speaking out, were writing letters to Putin, telling him that this is a sovereign country and he should not be taking pieces of it. One of those people was Bishop Filaret Kucherov of Lviv, and I would meet him later that summer of 2014. And in conversation, spontaneously, he revealed to me that he knows quite a bit about the Greek Catholic Church. He was able to quote Metropolitan Sheptytsky to me. If any of you have had a conversation with a Russian Orthodox bishop, you will know that this is not something that you would usually expect, this kind of level of intercultural knowledge. So I was really taken aback by that. And of course, by that time, by the summer of 2014, I was deeply immersed in, all the news that I could get about what is happening. And so one of the things that I became fascinated by was this, coming into the public view of the pro-Ukrainian faction of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. And that was my entry point into what has kind of snowballed into an investigation. It's still a work in progress, hopefully a book in my sabbatical year next year, about how this war has impacted different religious communities. When I began to look more closely at what was happening in Crimea, from the point of view of a person who teaches religious studies, I became interested in the fact that it's not just a social and a political and an economic story. There are religious communities here. They have their own history and tradition. These are indigenous people who've been here for many, many years and many centuries. they have concerns. I was remotely aware that, there had been this deportation, but I wasn't aware that to what extent the Crimean Tatars had become Ukrainian patriots since Ukraine's independence. So it was a learning curve. And same thing with Eastern Ukraine. When the conflict broke out there, part of the story that maybe was off the radar screen for a lot of people were hearing about what was happening politically or economically or socially in Ukraine. But the religious dimension was one that caught my attention. I began to study it a little more closely, and that's where I became interested in what was happening in Donetsk and Donbass to people who were Baptists or people who were part of the Jewish community, in particular the Hasidic Chabad Lubavitch Jews, who were practically the only ones who were there at that time. So, chopping things up here, hopefully to leave time for some discussion at the end. This presentation that I'm making today is the result of cutting an original article in half. It originally had included the Russian Orthodox Church. That's going to be a separate article that I'm finishing up right now. And this will probably be split up into 3 separate chapters as I snowball and learn about each individual community and learn, the language of each community. I may be referring to terms here. I'll try to define them for people who may not be familiar with what a madrasa is or what other technical terms there are. But it's a learning curve for me as well. So I don't pretend to be an expert. I'm pursuing this because I'm interested in I thought I was interested in particular religious communities, the Greek Catholic community that I had studied before, and the Russian Orthodox, which I think for ecumenical and other reasons is something that we need to know more about. But this war is really creating a kind of, I don't know, melting pot or hodgepodge, or an opportunity, really, to look at the religious question in new ways in Ukraine, in pluralistic ways, in ways that cross religious borders. So when I wrote what I'm reading from, my idea was that this study is an attempt at a preliminary reconstruction of the religious dimension of this last 2 years. Really, I'm covering 2014 primarily. The religious dimension by studying the war's impact on 3 religious minorities and their responses to it. As Crimea and Donbass changed hands, Muslims, Jews, and Baptists had to decide whether to remain under Russian rule or to escape as refugees. Those who stayed found themselves within a new legal and political framework which imposed a different modus operandi on religious communities. Those who left made haste to find a stable foothold, to organize assistance for families at home, and to adapt as religious communities to a new identity and mode of existence as refugees. The study of 3 communities, hopefully, I'm hoping, will enable a comparative appreciation of common patterns and particularities of religious response, adaptation, and self-reflection. It certainly does shed light on a deeper quest for religious meaning in the context of violent conflict. I will now do something I remember John Paul doing at one of his lectures, switching glasses. Now I can see. So the first section here that I have, I think I'll be skipping over a bunch of these things, is about the Crimean Tatars, and my, I guess, preliminary or temporary kind of title for what's going on here is that we're looking at organizational divisions among Crimea's Muslims. So for Crimea's 260,000 Muslims, the transitional year 2014 began with the Russian military takeover in February and the 16th of March referendum, or quote-unquote referendum, in favor of union with Russia. Even before that referendum, which many Crimean Tatars boycotted, their political sympathies were readily apparent to Russophile observers inside Russia. Together with other members of the Interconfessional Council of Crimea, Muslim leaders had overwhelmingly supported the territorial integrity of Ukraine, while mass rallies of Crimean Muslims included alternating chants of Allahu Akbar, which I hopefully pronounced correctly in Arabic, and glory to Ukraine in Ukrainian, so using both languages in their chants. Despite objections from the international community, the transfer of power became a fait accompli, and the Muslims of Crimea, as we know, found themselves in a new political, legal, and social environment. The third pivotal moment that year came on 21st of August. Here we go. In Simferopol, a new religious organization was created, the so-called Taurid Muftiat, which some may have heard of. More than any other event, it represented the religious dimension of the political transformation for the traditional community structures and the religious identity of Crimean Tatars. What is the Taurid Muftiat? On August 21st in Simferopol, under the ancient name of Crimea, Tauridia or Tauria, some would say, a central spiritual board of Muslims of Crimea was established as an Islamic jurisdiction that claimed continuity with a similarly titled institution in Imperial Russia, the Taurid Directorate. The new Muftiat was intended as an alternative to and ultimately a substitute for the existing organization, the Spiritual Board of Muslims of Crimea. I have it in Russian, I'll just read it in Russian very quickly. Духовное управление мусульман Крыма, if I pronounce it correctly, DUMK for short, and I will use DUMK for that. So that was the traditional organization that existed previously. For the secessionist authority under Sergei Aksyonov, the idea of historical continuity supported the legitimacy of the Russian annexation and of subsequent reforms. In addition, theological and security considerations were cited. According to the Taurid Muftiat's leader, Mufti Ruslan Saitvaliev, the organization would, I quote, combat the development of radical movements such as Wahhabis, Hizb ut-Tahrir, the Islamic Party of Liberation, and the Muslim Brotherhood. In his opinion, this was something that DUMK, the original organization, had failed to do. Saitvaliev alleged further that it had supported the development of those sectarians that I quote again, to this day the imams of most mosques in Crimea are representatives of Hizb ut-Tahrir or Wahhabis. On the other hand, the Taurid Muftiat proposed to guard against Islamic radicalism by promoting Sufism, for example, as a desirable form of traditional Islam, and by training their own imams rather than sending people to study abroad. So this was the stated rationale for the Taurid Muftiat. However, its deeper meaning emerges, I think, in connection with the Russian occupation and the larger context of events leading up to and following August 21st, 2014. Those events and the religious policies of the secessionist authorities fill out the picture of a coordinated campaign of repression and control of Muslims in Crimea. Losing my breath here. It was not long after the disputed Crimean referendum that the new authorities were implementing measures against Crimean Tatars because of their pro-Ukrainian sympathies. In fact, the referendum itself had taken place in the shadow of a brutal murder. Rishat Ahmet, an activist who had undertaken a solitary protest against the Russian occupation of Crimea on Simferopol's Lenin Square on March 3rd, was abducted and beaten to death. His body was found on March 15th, the eve of the referendum. When 3 other Muslims disappeared at the end of May, DUMK, the original organization, urged Crimean authorities to investigate the crimes, which for many signaled an alarming increase in human rights abuses in Crimea. Also in May, the occupation authorities banned the annual commemoration of the Bociurkiw, the 1944 deportation of Crimean Tatars by Stalin's regime, the first such obstruction since the observance had been initiated 20 years before. Keep track of time here. In June, the harassment of Muslims extended to the storming and search of a madrasa, a religious school, and of a family home by armed, masked, unidentified troops in Kolchugino, outside of Simferopol. The madrasa's deputy director, Aider Osmanov, was taken in for questioning by the MVD, and in late June, some Crimeans, accompanied by guests from Russia, launched a propaganda campaign accusing Crimea's Mejlis and DUMK of Islamist extremism, supported and financed by Ukraine. I will not take water, but I will take a lozenge. Responding on behalf of DUMK to these allegations, Mufti Said Ismailov appealed to the participants of the campaign to stop trying to split the Muslim community of Crimea. The All-Ukrainian Muslim Charitable Association, Al-Raid, also cited anti-Islamic provocations that accused DUMK, the Mejlis, and the Crimean Tatars of having ties with radical Islamist organizations. It confirmed the pro-Ukrainian positions of many Muslim societies in Ukraine, but attributed the allegations of extremism to, quote, the odious Russian Islamophobe Roman Silantiev, notorious for his scandalous anti-Islamic statements. And if you read the discussions, you become familiar with this name. He did write quite a bit of provocative items. In July, the chairman of the Mejlis, or the Council of Representatives of the Crimean Tatar people, Rafat Chubarov, and his predecessor Mustafa Djemilev met with Turkey's Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoglu to discuss concerns over an increase in repressions by the Russian Federation in Crimea. In May, Djemilev had been banned from entry into Crimea for 5 years, and Chubarov was denied entry in July. Those moves against the Muslim leadership effectively hamstrung the Mejlis. I quote one of the chairman of the Bakhchisarai district administration, "They took away our best people." And this was from a critic of the annexation who later himself was threatened with expulsion from Crimea if he did not keep his mouth shut. The situation only worsened in late August after the creation of the touted Muftiate. The assault on the Mejlis and the DUMK became more pronounced in public, with acting head of Crimea Sergei Aksyonov announcing that despite more than 20 years in operation, the Mejlis did not really exist because, quote, it had not been registered in the proper way. In October, the touted Muftiate was itself co-opted into the repression campaign after authorities ordered the surrender of Islamic literature that was prohibited under Russian law. A list of banned literature was published with the instruction that any such material was to be turned over to the Muftiate, touted Muftiate, by the end of the year. After December 31st, such literature would be confiscated. Russia's chief mufti, Talgat Tajunin, also became involved. he met with leaders of the traditional organizations, the Mejlis and the Dumk, in an effort to persuade them to get in step with the times. Echoing Silantiev, the Russian Islamophobe, Tajuddin's message came in the form of a plea for pragmatic realism. Their brand of traditionalism was no longer desirable, or as he put it, and I quote, "Now they are already part of Russia, and the best thing according to the will of the Almighty would be for them to unite with one another on the basis of traditional Islam of the Hanafi school. Then we will be prepared to cooperate with them." But not everyone in Russia was singing from that same songbook. Ravil Gainutin, head of the Council of Muftis of Russia, and aligned with Crimea's Dumk, opposed the establishment of the touted Muftiate, arguing that it would only divide the Muslim community. He called Tajuddin to task and demanded an explanation of his role in that organizational innovation. Tajuddin, for his part, denied any direct involvement. Gainutin also supported the right of the Mejlis leaders Mustafa Jamilev and Rifat Chubarov to enter Crimea, suggesting that they appeal to the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg. In fact, when the shoe was on the other foot, even Tajuddin could see through the untenable logic of seeking unity by way of division. In Russia, when under Gainutin's influence, the spiritual board of Muslims suddenly changed its name from the Dum of the European part of Russia to the Dum, Духовное управление Musulman, of the Russian Federation, Tajuddin warned that this would undermine the stability of the Ummah, of the Islamic community, and that the new Muftiate would not represent all Muslims of Russia. With evident exasperation, he asked, "What can change with the change of a name? Changes occur in our hearts, but instead of that, Gainutin declares the creation of parallel structures. How many ecclesiastical boards of Muslims can there be?" So questions being raised in Russia about that could also be asked in Crimea. By the end of 2014, the aims of Crimea's religious policy were clear. The touted Muftiate would serve as a key instrument of the repression campaign, whose aim it was to break down and ultimately liquidate traditional community organizations. Under a slogan of unification, its emergence sowed organizational confusion, polarization, and discord in the Muslim community. And while the final outcome of the policy was not yet known, the mobilization of Russian and Crimean authorities, as well as religious leaders and agitators in Russia, enabled a focused campaign of brutal repression, intimidation, and submission to Russian religious policy. On the pretext of combating Islamic extremism, pro-Ukrainian activists were systematically removed, and a pro-Russian line was put in place. The touted Muftiate, created specifically to assist in that transformation, was dedicated to imposing a new principle of unity in a Russian mold, even at the cost of dismembering the Crimean Tatar Ummah. Inside Russia, ideologues drew a direct connection with the Eastern Front, urging the Crimean occupation authorities to buy into the Russian war effort and to eliminate any pro-Ukrainian opposition that remained on the peninsula. Getting a little concerned about time. The Jews of Eastern Ukraine, or Donbass, displacement, competing loyalties. The difference here is that in Crimea, of the estimated 250, 260,000 Crimean Tatars, by the end of 2014, you're talking about 7,000 to 10,000 people leaving the peninsula to Ukraine. In the case of Jews of Donbass, we'll see that basically it's literally those who cannot move, who were left behind. Everybody else pretty much left, evacuated Donetsk and Luhansk and the areas surrounding. The Euromaidan protest, which began in Kyiv in December 2013 may be considered a turning point in Jewish-Ukrainian relations. On February 20th, when 3 Ukrainian Jews lost their lives in Kyiv, along with other innocent victims of sniper fire, citizens of Ukraine took note of that sacrifice and of the fact that many more Ukrainian Jews had participated in the demonstrations demanding political accountability, trade relations with the EU, and a less Soviet Ukraine. On April 15th, as the Jewish community of Donetsk began to celebrate Passover, unidentified masked men approached the synagogue and distributed leaflets addressed to the, quote, respected citizens of Jewish nationality, I think you have it right there, from the independent Donetsk Republic. The leaflet accused Jews of supporting the Banderite junta in Kyiv and of hostility toward the Orthodox Donetsk Republic, and ordered all Jewish citizens aged 16 or older to register with the Commissar for Nationality Affairs and to provide notarized documents for all immovable property. The leaflet concluded with a threat. I quote, "In the event of refusal to register, guilty parties will be deprived of citizenship and forcibly deported outside of the Republic, and their property will be confiscated." Despite subsequent denials by the authorities who were cited in the document, the Donetsk Council of Churches and Religious Organizations issued an immediate appeal to the police and government authorities to stop the, as they called it, rabid xenophobia and blatant anti-Semitism by the separatists of the so-called DNR. Other analyses subsequently concluded that while it was difficult to determine the actual source of the leaflets with any certainty, the incident was more likely either a provocation to discredit the DNR or the initiative of anti-Semitic agitators from Russia. With the local interreligious council's response, while the local interreligious council's response was a significant indication of religious cooperation across religious boundaries in Ukraine's regions, a very different reading was not long in coming from the Jewish community in Russia. On May 2nd, after clashes, there we go, in Odessa between supporters and opponents of the Maidan, Molotov cocktails were thrown into the House of Labor Unions, and as a result, 46 people died. Rabbi Zinoviy Kogan, vice president of the Congress of Jewish Religious Communities and Organizations in Russia, attributed that tragedy to the emergence of fascism and Russophobia in Ukraine. Kogan looked at the preceding upheavals in Ukraine and concluded that the Odessa tragedy was, I quote, a horrible murder committed by people who were nurtured by the Maidan and poisoned by nationalism, Russophobia, hatred, and cruelty. He further compared the tragedy to the time, and I quote, when during the Second World War, Jews and non-Jews were herded into barns and buildings and burned alive. Turning his attention to Russia, he then praised Patriarch Kirill's firm and moving pronouncement on the subject, but bemoaned the silence of the rabbis in Ukraine, who seemed to be acting as if nothing had happened. The issue of anti-Semitism was revisited in early July when Alexander Bohdan, president of the Federation of Jewish Communities of Russia, stated that the continued glorification of the quote-unquote xenophobe Stepan Bandera by the Svoboda Party in Ukraine was but one manifestation of a rehabilitation of Nazism in Ukraine. At that same time, Russia's chief rabbi, Beryl Lazar, felt that it was an opportune moment to thank Putin for Russia's genuine concern about threats of neo-Nazism, even as leaders of in other countries, quote-unquote, prefer to remain silent about this. In the context of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, there was nothing oblique about that reference. By mid-September, the synagogue in Donetsk had been closed for over a month. And the World Forum for Russian Jewry reported that after the displacement of thousands of Jews from eastern Ukraine to Kyiv, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Israel, the Jewish religious communities of Donetsk and Luhansk had practically ceased to exist. So that's one account. And I am trying to figure out what seems to be another narrative here. And it focuses on another rabbi at Donetsk, Rabbi Andrii Krawchuk, who responded to a journalist's questions about Ukrainian army bombs hitting civilian residences and about the Ukrainian government praising Nazi war criminals. Rabbi Krawchuk insisted that he did not involve himself in political questions. Everyone has his own opinion and can express it. But what might first have appeared as the cautious neutrality of a Ukrainian patriot took a rather different turn. Further on in the same interview, Krawchuk described his relations with the separatist authorities as tight and declared that he was certain that the anti-Semitic leaflets, which had appeared in mid-April under Donetsk People's Republic insignia, had not come from the rebel government. He denied that there had been an aliyah, a migration of Jews to Israel, saying instead that people just left the area. And significantly, he made no mention of Chief Rabbi of Donetsk, Rabbi Veshetsky, or of 13 Chabad Lubavitch emissaries who had left Donetsk after serving there for many years. In his version, all was quiet. And I quote, "Jewish communal life did not stop for a moment since the beginning of the events." In the previous account, we had virtually all the community leaving and the synagogue closed. So Jewish communal life did not stop for a moment since the beginning of the events. Daily prayers in the synagogue continue as usual. Perhaps there was one time when there were no meetings for a period of a week, but the synagogue was never closed down. Everything functions, the school functions, the kindergarten functions. We are working as usual. So quite a different perspective from the other one that we heard from Pinchas Veshetsky. After serving as chief rabbi of Donetsk for some 20 years, Rabbi Veshetsky had fled to Kyiv in August of 2014. And from a makeshift office in the capital, he was continuing to direct the Jewish Center in Donetsk and to coordinate relief work for refugees. According to Chabad sources, 13 emissary families had been serving in the Donetsk Jewish community before the war. And by the end of the year, only 3 families were still working alongside the Veshetskys in Kyiv, and the rest had temporarily relocated to Israel. As for the Donetsk synagogue, one of the online sources that I have used, portalcredo.ru, reported on 18 September that that synagogue had been closed since mid-August. So it remained unclear whether any external Russian interference or pressure was involved in the Donetsk Jewish community's change of leadership, anything comparable to what was happening in Crimea. This transition from Rabbi Veshetsky to Rabbi Krawchuk. Now, the importance of Donetsk is that was the largest Jewish community in Donbass, the central one. Again, concerned about time. Outside of the war zone, Jewish communities also tried to negotiate their way between patriotic loyalty and political neutrality. Chabad Rabbi Moshe Moskowitz of Kharkiv did not object to individual Jews taking personal stands on the war, but he felt that, I quote, "the Jewish community should wait and see how things turn out rather than taking political sides." But for other members of the Kharkiv Jewish community, there was a substantive difference between patriotism and partisan politics. Elena Dankina, a supporter of the new government in Kyiv, had joined the Euromaidan protests calling for Yanukovych's ouster in Kharkiv and found herself alongside members of the right-wing Svoboda party. and I quote her now, "If someone had told me a year ago that I would stand calmly next to people from Svoboda, I would never have believed it. I categorically thought that Svoboda Party was not a party that I could stand next to." But she noted that after the party was elected to parliament in 2012, it dropped its anti-Semitic rhetoric and went more mainstream. Even sharper differences of perspective among Jews were evident inside the conflict zone and on both sides of the front line. Alexander Kaufman, the Jewish foreign minister of the Donetsk separatists, who had announced that it is a sacred duty of Israel to recognize us diplomatically, later reported that several dozen former Israeli Defense Forces soldiers were serving with the rebels in Donetsk. Among them was communist Ina Levitan, who declared, I quote, "As an Israeli, I personally, viscerally hate fascists." On the Ukrainian side, Asher Joseph Cherkassky was a local Hasidic Jew and soldier who had fought in Donetsk, and he considered it a civic obligation to defend Ukraine. Cherkassky's unit, the Dnipro Battalion, was funded by Dnipropetrovsk Jewish former regional governor, billionaire oligarch Igor Kolomoisky. Jewish communities in eastern Ukraine experienced a polarization perhaps in some ways similar to what was happening with Crimean Muslims in at least one important respect. Loyalty to the state was the crucial criterion for defining where one stood. And so the competing alignments with either Ukraine or Russia produced opposite perspectives on the war and its desired outcome. But unlike Crimea, which Russia claimed for itself after the disputed referendum, Ukraine's occupied eastern regions retained their hybrid republican status much longer. And except for some uncertainty about the personnel change between the two rabbis that I was talking about, there was no coercive imposition of an new organizational structure for the Jewish communities that remained in Donetsk and Luhansk. As long as the conflict remained unresolved, prudence for them seemed to favor a politically neutral posture. But those who managed to flee had the opportunity to express their patriotism openly. How's the clock? Okay. These are pictures I just took off the internet, and so you got Turchinov there. I'm not really talking about Turchinov, but he's recognizable, so I thought I'd put him in there. It was for the poster, but you know, it's good enough for the poster, it's good enough for PowerPoint. Baptist of Eastern Ukraine. I just called it different readings of Scripture, and you'll see what I mean by that. I'm really just looking for the underlying dynamics, and what I'm doing here is describing what is the lay of the land, trying to get the kind of empirical picture, and the plan is to once that backdrop is created, to look more closely at theological themes that begin to emerge. And when I say theological, you'll see in this section how the Baptists really kind of bring that to the forefront. So the Baptist internal debate was perhaps the most complex, and for me the most intriguing of the three groups considered here. Initially, it centered on two documents of the 34th Baptist Congress of the Russian Union of Evangelical Christians Baptists, which took place in St. Petersburg at the end of May 2014, and the ensuing controversy between Baptists in Russia and their brethren in Ukraine. On the surface, the polarization or difference of opinion was similar to those noted in the other religious communities, essentially a division of perspectives along either pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian lines. But unlike the other controversies, the Baptist one produced official documents and a wide-ranging public debate, with each side putting forward well-developed arguments on the interpretation of Scripture, the discernment of divine truth, and the proper application of both Scripture and divine truth to real human contexts. So I want to briefly outline the highlights of that exchange. Baptist Congress in St. Petersburg produced two documents: a resolution on the situation in Ukraine and an open letter to Putin. Some days before they were made public, an early draft was leaked by way of an audio tape, and the tempest was unleashed. Mikhail Cherenkov, a professor at the Drahomanov National Pedagogical University in Kyiv, and according to other publications, he, I think, was a dean of the Protestant University in Donetsk prior to that. Has some associations with the Ukrainian Catholic University as well. And vice president of the Association for Spiritual Renewal. So Mikhail Cherenkov objected vehemently to this draft resolution's reference to the situation in Ukraine as a domestic confrontation. Frustrated that his Baptist brothers in Russia were blind to the facts of the men in green, as well as to the annexation of Crimea and other threats, Cherenkov noted with frustration that what the whole world sees, Russians do not see at close range. They believe their own television more than their Ukrainian brethren, Baptists and Baptists. They believe government propaganda more than the UN Security Council. Apparently, his message found its mark, because when the document, that was only a draft that was leaked, when the final document was actually published, the phrase domestic confrontation was replaced by a more open-ended armed conflict. Another passage in the draft also stirred controversy when it cited biblical principle in questioning the Ukrainian revolution. The passage affirmed that the Baptist Union's adherence to biblical teaching, which does not embrace the violent overthrow of legal government, nationalism, and the resolution of social and political contradictions by means of arms, do not associate with rebels, according to Proverbs 24:21. And to this, again, Cherenkov responds, I quote, "They accuse Ukrainians, including Ukrainian Baptists, of the violent overthrow of a legal government and of nationalism." Which legal government? The murderers and thieves of Yanukovych, who fled to Russia? Of what kind of nationalism do they accuse us? Hitherto, no kind of nationalism has been observed. This is a Baptist talking. Baptists are, fairly sensitive to any kind of association with the state. Although now Russian Baptists, without thinking, are repeating the words of government propaganda. On this point, there had been no substantive change from the original draft to the final text. And pressed on the matter, Yuri Sipko, past president of the Russian Baptist Council, indicated a very different reading of the same text. I quote him, "Read the document with a cool head. You will discover that all the words about the unacceptability of the overthrow of a legal government pertain to the current actions of militants in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. After all, the government in Kyiv is legitimate. There are no armed actions there. There are no insurrections there. All insurrections are taking place in the east. And the condemnation of revolutionaries expresses very precisely the attitude of the Baptist Council of the so-called militias from Russia and to everybody who supports them." So Sipko's reading, this interpretation between the lines, if not reading between the words, suggests that maybe he was even on the resolution committee that composed the text in the first place, but any calculation on his part that an ambiguous text would kill two birds with one stone by pleasing both Russians in Russia and Ukrainians in Ukraine appeared to have backfired. On June 4th, Pastor Yuri Simonenko in Alchevsk, Luhansk province, addressed an open letter to his Baptist brethren in Russia who had participated in the May Congress in St. Petersburg. He had felt a deep pain ever since the Congress had completed its work. As compared with the blows that Christians may expect at any time for their faith, he concluded that nowadays, quote, those blows are coming ever more often from our own brothers in the faith. And those blows are all the more painful because they are delivered with reference to Scripture. Simonenko cited the example of the idea that there is no authority but from God, Romans 13:1. There was considerably more to it, he explained, than simply passive compliance to civil authorities. The Lord bestows authority on man, but he also takes it away when man proves unworthy of it. And God has plenty of ways to remove authority. As I watched the events on the Maidan, I clearly saw the hand of divine judgment taking power away from a man who was caught stealing and who had dared to make a mockery of his solemn promise to the electorate. Ihor Bandura, vice president of the Baptist Council of Ukraine and pastor in Odessa, attended the May Congress as well and was alarmed and disturbed by the emerging difference of opinion among Baptists over the situation in Ukraine. To describe it as a domestic civil conflict, again, and a fratricidal war, as far as he was concerned, was inaccurate. This, he said, is external aggression. The challenge lay in establishing the truth in a situation where propaganda had taken over the public discourse and consolidated a conflict of interpretations. It also made a huge difference whether one lived in a country where the will of the people was to move towards democracy or in a society that was falling back into totalitarianism. As for Christians, they were morally bound to pursue an internal search for the truth, regardless where they lived, regardless whether they had access to accurate information or only to disinformation and propaganda. Bandura was convinced that as long as they made an honest effort to discern the real truth, the Lord will certainly reveal it. Nor were these theological abstractions. The very unity of Baptists in Ukraine and Russia was at stake. Bandura was deeply troubled to note such an incapacity of religious discernment among his brethren in Russia. I quote, "It seemed to me that some brothers had begun to recall the Soviet Union with nostalgia, when there was a single empire and when everybody spoke a single language, when everyone walked in step. And now, commenting on events in Ukraine, people are saying with regret, it was different. And I note with horror that some Baptist ministers are nostalgic for the Soviet Union." I think this is an unhealthy trend, and part of the reason for it is that people are swallowing propaganda uncritically. On the one hand, Baptists were called to stand together across political borders and not to allow armed conflicts to undermine their fundamental spiritual unity. But once the truth had been discerned, the church in Ukraine was duty-bound to take a stand together with the people. For Bandura, his church bore a responsibility to serve as salt and light for those who suffered, delivering consolation and support where needed, and bringing meaning to the deepest questions of human existence. A similar sense of Christian moral responsibility was affirmed by the president of the Baptist Council of Ukraine, Valery Antonyuk. In his view, the difference between Ukrainian and Russian Baptists was not about language or ethnicity or political ideology, but about the Christian thirst for truth and justice. I quote him, "Ukraine is not Russia. The difference is that here in Ukraine, the changes that occurred in recent months are directly connected with the fact that the people's thirst for truth and justice is manifest." Nor could the Baptist Church afford to align itself with any particular state. Otherwise, for Antonyuk, it ran the risk of becoming politicized, disconnected from the truth, and possibly in collaboration with structures of power, with evil structures of power. When the church is too partisan, I'm quoting, "it cannot speak God's truth. When Christians make purely political statements, pleasing the powers that be, that is improper and undignified. I recall the balanced and proper position taken by church ministers during the rise of the Third Reich. Obedience to tyrants is equal to disobedience towards God, according to Dietrich Bonhoeffer and a group of pastors. Unfortunately, they were few. Antoniuk's reflection brought the discussion back to the issue of self-serving or non-committal interpretations of Romans 13, no authority except from God. Rather than justifying dictatorship and encouraging Christian submissiveness, the Pauline principle was a reminder that human authority remained accountable to its divine source. In a Christian perspective, justice could only be achieved when the two were aligned, and no amount of political manipulation of the truth could ever produce authentic justice. In their extended controversy over the war, the Baptists of Ukraine considered the root cause of the difference between them and their brothers in Russia as neither ideological nor political. Instead, it had to do with the discernment of truth in light of Scripture, and Ukrainian Baptists set about fraternally correcting their brethren in Russia, whose reading and interpretation of Scripture had gone off the rails. I really have to count the minutes here. Really? So basically what I do here is I go back briefly over each individual group and then talk about some of the common threads. For the Crimean Tatars, who supported the integrity of Ukraine and opposed Russia's annexation of Crimea, the imposition of new leaders, structures, and ideas from Russia threatened the stability of their social and religious traditions. The new order represented a sharp dissonance with the immediate past, and connected as it was with a brutal campaign of repression, harassment, and murder, it was a shocking reminder of their massive deportation, the Surgun, in 1944. As Russia took control of the peninsula in 2014, many Tatars fled to other regions in Ukraine and thus retained their citizenship. Those who remained in their traditional lands under a different flag recognized that they could no longer commemorate the Surgun or support Ukraine. Their religious adherence and practice would also be under constant surveillance and suspicion of extremism. Many Hasidim of Donbass, like Jews throughout Ukraine, were staunch supporters of Ukrainian sovereignty and the democratic European values of the Maidan. The horror of seeing their cities and towns bombed was compounded by anti-Semitic incidents, which harked back to patterns not seen since the Holocaust. Uprooted and displaced from Donetsk and Luhansk, they left behind the traces of once vibrant communities. Torn between neutrality and engagement on the home front, they found themselves painfully at odds with their co-religionists in Russia, who subscribed to the official discourse of Ukraine as a hotbed of fascism, neo-Nazism, and Russophobia, and who extended that critique to their Jewish brothers in Ukraine. In confronting the challenges of the war, many found that their traditional spiritual practices had immense power. This is a section I didn't read, that their spiritual practices had immense power to nourish hope that their communities would survive the war, displacement, and separation. The Baptist story provided the gripping image of a community in the throes of an agonizing critical self-reflection. For a religious community that had virtually no ethno-national language, and which prided itself on its cosmopolitan distance from such concerns, it was remarkable how a deep theological reflection about the real situation could generate such heated internal debate about divine truth and social justice as illuminated by the gospel. As evangelical Christians, their port of call in the crisis, of course, was Scripture. Exegesis and prayerful reflection were the way to discern the divine will and to define human moral responsibility. The prophetic witness of Baptist pastors and leaders of Ukraine give evidence of their discernment of the signs of the times, of their sense of ethical obligations that arise from such discernment, and of the courageous stands of the few who challenge their own communities in times of social turmoil. Now, despite the particularities or differences, there were also common threads among the religious minorities of Ukraine. The first and most obvious was the replacement of Ukrainian political authority with a Russian or pro-Russian one. Whether they liked it or not, Crimean Tatars, Donbas Jews, Donbas Baptists were told virtually overnight that they were no longer citizens of Ukraine. Some welcomed the change as a sort of long-awaited liberation, while others remained skeptical, neutral, or opposed. The primary impact of the war and of occupation on the three religious communities was the exacerbation of old divisions and the introduction of new ones, and the imposition of mechanisms of control and co-optation by the authorities. While the ranks of combat troops on both sides of the front were quickly dotted with Muslims and Jews, in some cases token representatives, their home communities were left with the daunting task of maintaining some semblance of unity and of grappling with a hellish question: how was mortal combat possible between people of the same faith tradition? Not to mention the controversies that we mentioned. Religious communities found themselves fragmented and divided in various ways. What used to be a rich diversity of ethnic backgrounds, linguistic preferences, and even political loyalties now became a matter of categorical, mutually exclusive options. As one religious community could have, any one religious community could have members who were pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian. And time and again, ethnicity had very little to do with where one stood. As families split over the conflict, religious communities also came to know the challenge of trying to hold things together. The departure and displacement of refugees divided communities physically, geographically, and politically. Even worse, each of these Ukrainian religious communities also felt the separation from its counterparts in Russia, who saw things in a different light. So the social fragmentation and polarization caused by the war was carried over into the religious communities, aggravating pre-existing latent differences and instigating new hostilities. The secessionist authorities likewise used a variety of measures to assert control over and to co-opt the religious communities. Repression and intimidation were the preferred tools to remove undesirable community leaders and books, and to prohibit traditional observances that were deemed subversive. Suspicion of extremism or pro-Ukrainianism became a carte blanche for the authorities to be the law. The co-optation of religious communities occurred in a variety of ways, including the imposition of new organizational structures and flying in VIPs from Moscow to spell out how the life of minority religious communities would look after harmonization with Russian law. But the impact of Russia's intervention was only part of the religious story. Ukraine's minority faith communities also mounted a wide range, and this is a separate story, of responses in their home territories and in the diaspora, adjusting their activities in order to survive, providing assistance to casualties of war and their families, organizing relief for refugees, lending support to the war effort, taking principled stands on matters of conscience, maintaining lines of communication among members of their divided communities, and upholding fundamental human values over which everything began at the Euromaidan. Through social engagement in the time of national crisis, they forged new bonds internally and also created opportunities for crossing religious borders with assistance to others in need. In diverse situations, people of faith discovered new how their traditional beliefs and practices were enduring sources of strength, resilience, and hope.
He's looking at me because of it. Oh, there you are. Yes, so thank you for such a fascinating overview of these diverse groups, and I imagine that there are questions, and so I invite questions from the audience. We'll start with Bohdan.
First, a small question and then a bit of a larger question. The small question is, with the establishment of the Tawhid Muftiyate and the criticism that the previous religious organizations in Crimea were infiltrated really by Wahhabism, right? I was wondering to what extent that was a true charge. I mean, I know Saudi Arabia spreads it all over the place, and I imagine that they could easily send clerics there. So that's my small question. My larger question is, when you talk about the Crimean Tatars and the Jews, you're talking not just about religious communities, but national communities. And in particular, like when that leaflet, you know, it addressed people of Jewish nationality. And so how do you conceptualize those differences? Because not every member of the Jewish nationality or Jewish community is religious. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I can't say that I've done at this stage. I'm just really trying to construct a picture of what is going on. I am aware of that difference. You could say the same thing with the Muslim community, I believe, as well, practicing or non-practicing. But the organizations, some of the organizations are religious organizations, others are not. So the religious ones, if you're doing a religious analysis, you're paying attention to them. What I want to do in the subsequent stage is to look at people who are expressing a religious standpoint, who are quoting Torah or who are quoting, you know, from their scriptures, and are trying to analyze the situation and figure out what's the proper, you know, moral stand should be from a religious standpoint. So that would be explicit. And I'm not looking for you know, an ethno-national. I'm looking specifically for kind of religious ideas behind that. So I'm not there yet. I wouldn't have even an answer to the first simple question yet. Yeah. Yeah. I have to be, you know, humble and forthright.
Andrii, thank you very much for an interesting talk. I have two questions, and I don't know whether they're small or large. The first one might be small. Do we have any information about the Karaim in Crimea? That is the Jewish community with Crimean Tatar cultural features. Are they in any way present, reacting to all this? What do we know about them? And the second question is, how did the Russian Baptists react to the murder of the 7 evangelical preachers in Donetsk? I know there have been other murders, but I'm curious, how did the Russian Baptists react to this?
You're stopping me again. I don't have an answer to that, like what the reaction of the Russians were to the murder of the 7, or any other murders. And as far as Karaim, I have them on my list. I need to do some investigation, but I'm really looking for communities that are large enough to have some kind of, you know, reasonable coverage that I can begin with, and then to look at their history. I think that the way, I'm not really answering your question, I'm just getting back to my own methodology. The way that I might want to handle smaller groups, smaller communities, is to look at them as specifically that, as smaller communities, no matter where they are, and how are they facing these challenges. For the moment, I think the diversity that I'm seeing in these three communities, and the Russian Orthodox is another one that I'm working on right now. The issue of internal polarization is very key, and the difference of perspectives between Ukraine and Russia. And there's something in that tells me it's not just about being pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian. I mean, it's buying into entire systems of thought and applying your scriptures and saying this is where the will of God is, and being shocked by the difference of perspective. I apologize for not answering to the question. I'm taking note of these things, and this will be useful to me in my further work. Yeah.
Question is guided by the fact that there are Canaanite musicians with Crimean Tatars who are Muslims.
Right.
So there is a cooperation between Jews and Muslims in Crimea on a musical level. They have very beautiful musical groups. And so I wondered whether this spilled into another level.
Is this cooperation something that happened recently, in the past year or two?
It's been there before.
It's been there,
but
yeah.
it has now come to this. In other words, we are more aware of it than we were before.
What Heather had referred to, my kind of current area of research being interreligious dialogue, I am actively also looking for not just the individual isolated accounts of these communities on their own, with all the polarization and internal kind of controversies that they have to deal with, but looking at the war as a new context in which bridges are being built as never before, where the pro-Ukrainian element is one that kind of invites a religious dialogue that is something that was symbolized by the prayer tent at Euromaidan, something that the Protestants put up originally as a denominational item, but which very quickly became an interdenominational reality. So I'm really curious about how even spontaneously, not just from the top-down kind of leadership decisions about ecumenical conversations and so on might be happening, but how spontaneously, as a result of the social movement from the grassroots, people are taking advantage of opportunities to think about their fundamental values from their religious tradition, and to see how that can connect with other people who are really fighting for the same civil society kind of values. Yeah, really not answered. Maybe there's a question I can answer. Something easy.
Ivan Gazichenko, Kyiv postdoctoral fellow. Yes. Thank you, Professor Krawchuk, for so inspiring and very broad lecture. I have some small comments and two questions. Small comments. I don't know how far you go in terms of researching like local perspectives. You mentioned Kharkiv, and actually, in terms of Jewish community, it's taken sides over there. So this rabbi, I think it's Hasidic community, but there is a quite interesting character called Eduard Hodos, and he was active supporter of anti-Maidan, and actually he developed the concept of Jewish fascism, and it's interesting, and he has quite a big presence in terms of online spaces of anti-Maidan. So maybe it can be interesting for your further research. Also, Baptist community, it's really facilitated and reinforced volunteer networks, just because they had very good connections with Germany and other European countries. there is a lot of humanitarian help went through these organizations, which might be of interest for you. And so questions. Actually, my first question is about Orthodox community and Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. I heard such opinion that actually Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine hasn't recognized annexation. So Crimea is still Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate. So it never was transferred. So in legal terms, annexation never happened to Ukrainian church. And another question, what was, you look at community level and these official statements, but what is the reaction of international organizations? In terms of Crimean Tatars, what about Muslim World League reaction to what was happening? And what is the reaction of, say, Jewish religious leaders in Jerusalem? How did they react to this events you just described? Thank you.
You got me there. Your first question was about
the actual
the Russian Orthodox
annexation by the Ukrainian.
Yeah, I know that there is that issue of non-recognition. I don't know that there would have been a statement, challenging Russia's political claims, but in terms of ecclesiastical jurisdiction, you have something there. I know that after the annexation, there were meetings that took place. I don't have them on the tip of my tongue, but the representatives of and the leadership of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate traveled to Crimea after annexation to participate in some of these meetings. So it's a confirmation that at least for some time, I don't know what the situation is today, that there was this kind of discontinuity. They probably would not have challenged Russia's claims as political claims, but the ecclesiastical thing was still not resolved. So yeah, I don't know where that is today, but you're absolutely right that even after the annexation, there were still activities on the part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate that indicated continuity of administrative kind of lines of authority. I haven't studied the international Jewish reaction to what's happening. I know that on the humanitarian side, there's very extensive assistance. And the two countries that emerge as very important are Israel and the United States. The Chabad is very, very active in both countries. I don't know if that rabbi that you were speaking about in Kharkiv is also a member of Chabad, or if he's a member of another.
Actually, I think this Moscowitz is a rabbi, and the other guy is secular.
Okay.
He actually pulled this idea of Zionist conspiracy and so on. So he plays on the side of pro-Russian separatists. So, I mean, like if you study both sides, I mean, it would be interesting to look.
Yeah. I'm a little bit still not clear. I probably will write directly to Chabad. They're well represented in Canada, and they seem to be quite approachable. To clarify this difference between these two rabbis I was talking about in Donetsk, quite surprising difference of accounts about what's going on. One saying, it's all over, it's game over, it's just the elderly and the people who were not able to get out that are still there. The synagogue is closed and everything. The other guy saying, quite the opposite. It's, little strange. I appreciate those suggestions for further investigation. I keep coming back in my mind to John Paul's question about conceptualizing the difference between. I'm wondering if you had anything else behind that. Between the
Muslims are not Tatars in Ukraine. There are a number of Muslims in Ukraine. But of course, it's the Tatars who are most affected. But I was just really curious how you were handling that. And I guess what you're saying is that these are national communities, but you're looking more at what the religious spokesmen
I'm specifically interested in that. I'm also, again, on my learning curve, I'm discovering, what the diversity is, and there is diversity of even the religious Muslims of Ukraine, considerable diversity. So, it's part of the. Like once this gets split up into three sections, the Muslim chapter will be much more detailed. Anyway.
Another question. This may be hard. What were your sources?
My sources are online and journalistic. My editor for this thing, which I was mentioning to Heather, so a version of this is already going to publication, and the editors come back, well, we want some scholarly sources, And I says, okay, there's certainly material out there of a historical nature. A lot of it, going up to the Maidan, or in the best case, covering a part of 2014. But no, there's not going to be an in-depth analysis, and I am, here and there finding some preliminary, much less historical reconstruction, and then, another level, another stage of theological analysis. There are particular individuals. You mentioned David. Cyril Hovorun on the Russian Orthodox side. Some of these Protestant people. I mean, I hope to meet them when I go to Ukraine, because they're just brilliant. But nothing has yet been produced of a synthetic scholarly nature. So historiography is definitely available, and I'll be able to beef up a bibliography, of that type. But in terms of anything beyond articles that are just now beginning to be published, I'm afraid, I'm using journalism and official statements, documents like from the St. Petersburg Congress and other things. My Russian Orthodox chapter has, my interview with Bishop Filaret Kucherov in view. Statements by Patriarch Kirill. So official things that are on the record. So I'm using texts, again, basic source for religious ideas. What do people officially say? But a big part of this is also not just the leaders, what the leaders are saying, but what's happening at the grassroots, what people are thinking, what they're formulating. So there's a lot of ferment, and it's methodologically it's a bit challenging, and I can't say I really have a complete handle on it. And it may be that each of these communities will require a slightly different modified approach to get at the best analysis and religious kind of ideas perspective on it. So, it's where I am at the moment.
Just a quick question about sources and text.
Yes.
Has anyone collected the sermons of these people? I was listening to Mufti Ismailov's sermons, and I'm very impressed by the intellect of the man. And I'm just wondering whether anyone is planning a comparative collection of sermons or preaching texts by the various groups.
That's a brilliant question. I think I'm going to have to get your source for Ismailov, because that's absolutely accessible. He has a Facebook page. Yes. That's what Phil Red Kucherov. I went to him. I took all the efforts to meet him and all this. Nice guy. But then I says, where do I get more? He says, I have a website. So, it's all there. Yeah, I know.
Okay, sorry.
Walter Salat history on evangelicalism during Soviet times after World War II, and he describes the chauvinism of Russian Baptists with respect to Ukrainian Baptists, how they sort of had a sort of superiority complex. But he also describes how at various times they all did come together because they were actually fighting for their survival, and so they had a real
Common cause.
commonality.
Right.
And also there's the aspect of not sufficiently, I think, amongst Ukrainians, and Ukrainian diaspora have taken sufficient account of Russian paranoia, feeling that they're being set upon by the West, and that is really deeply embedded in the Russian psyche. And I think Ukrainians have to take more account of that and try to understand that when they're trying to understand why Russians act the way they act. And I see their actions as sort of originating from that paranoia, and we tend to dismiss it and say the West is not a threat in any way, but NATO has gone into Eastern Europe and has surrounded Russia, and there was more or less a promise, understanding that that was not supposed to happen. Now I know there's people that disagree with me, that look upon NATO as this totally...
No.
But the thing is that we are setting ourselves up, believing that NATO can, that through violence, and NATO represents the means to warfare, that is the solution. That is not the solution, and so that's why I'm not as hard on the Russians, and that's even though I'm more for Ukraine and I believe in Ukraine, and ultimately I believe that Ukraine will come out as a better example and as a more democratic country or people, but somehow Ukrainians need to try and understand the Russians and their history and where they're at.
I couldn't agree with you more, and thank you for the comment or question.
Sorry,
No. Oh, yeah. I was wondering who it was that was. No. My appreciation stems from the fact that my underlying kind of search here is for new ways of seeing the differences between religious communities. There has not been much dialogue across, the table from the Russian Orthodox. There has not been much room, but now that, and this is a topic for another, next time you invite me, the Russian Orthodox, the pro-Ukrainian side, which is coming in and saying Ukraine is a sovereign state, and writing a letter to Putin to that effect, at risk of discipline from their own patriarch. This at the very least is an opening for those who will see the opportunity for dialogue. I mean, there are possibilities, and I'm certainly looking for those possibilities. I believe, again, this is just now undocumented, not even from online sources, that the ultimate question in terms of religious peace and religious dialogue, at risk of sounding like I'm saying what Kirill said with his meeting with the Pope, the first question for Ukraine and dialogue in Ukraine is that between the Ukrainian churches and the Russian church. It's Russian-Ukrainian relations. That's the biggest question there is. There was another question, I think, right?
You mentioned a good chunk of the Jewish community from the Donbass. Part of them ended up seeking temporary refuge in Israel. Do you have an idea of how large a community that is, and where they sit on this? I mean, we had here in October Yitzhak Brudny, who teaches at Jerusalem University, and he mentioned them and said he was shocked at how many of them are very pro-Russian. I mean, they've left because of the fighting and they don't want to be there in the chaos and everything like that. It's not as if they left because they don't want to be under Russian rule.
Right. I don't know. If they're pro-Russian, I can probably guess that they were part of the general Donbass culture.
Yeah, well, we know in the Jewish community in Israel, many of them still are sort of Soviet Jews, and even if they came from Odessa or whatever, think of themselves as Soviet and Russian, and Ukraine's kind of odd to them. But,
Yeah. Even I don't know. Even maybe pro-Ukrainian people coming from Donbass, coming to Halychina or something would come off probably like some carryover of, it's a different culture there. Yeah. In terms of numbers, I don't know that. I know that quite a few. That was the basic choice, either to go to Israel or to other parts of Ukraine. It depended in large measure based on people I actually met and spoke to, if they had family in other regions. Dnipropetrovsk, there's a lot of Jews there. There was a conference in 2014 in Dnipropetrovsk, and literally in the summer, it was June, and there's some Jewish people. You were there, Zenon, as well, and people were getting phone calls from home, Donetsk or Luhansk, and saying, "Oh, my family just told me don't come home from this conference." Whoever could was leaving, and maybe as they were leaving, they didn't realize that they would never be coming back. They didn't make plans. Well, am I going to go to Israel? I mean, some people would be, some of the people that Pinkas Veshetsky was helping had to process papers to get documents in order before they could leave, even leave Ukraine. So there's all kinds of circumstances. This is your classic wartime migration type of humanitarian crisis. Yeah.
So are we going to end on that cheery note? Seeing no other questions, I want to thank you, Andrii, for a stimulating talk, and thank all of the audience for coming on a Friday night of a holiday weekend in the snow. Thank you very much.